Guys, welcome back to the channel. It's your favorite reactor, Senpai Reacts, and we got a special video. We're going to be reacting to the amazing NiziU Make You Happy news video. We're going to travel back in time. I think it's like maybe like one of their first songs. It's like pretty old song. So we're going to do a little time travel and go back in time and check out this video. Make sure you check out my other NiziU videos. I have Sweet Notification, and recently I did Heartless. So make sure you go check that out, and let's jump straight into this one. I bet he gonna fall down. I'm like, bro, you don't get out of my face. I like the different scenes for this song and like the locations. Oh, this look dope. NiziU.
I'm so hot, no goodbye, baby, goodbye. Tell me like ooh ah, see me do na BIC. I'm so hot, no goodbye, baby, goodbye. 君がくれる安心寄り添って集めるための場所。光が満ちて for you、いつだって夢見てるの一緒。
I expect this rapping.
Sweet なメロディー、本当に癒してくれそうで。Put it on repeat、聞いてずっとずっと You're my favorite song。
I like that. I like about NiziU, like they make a lot of like happy music. Like you just can't help but smile, and like you just bobbing because like you just feel happy with their songs and like watching their news videos. It's just like it just gives you a gut feeling. It's just you don't find that in a lot of other places. Like but like they just happy. That's all it is. Just happy music. NiziU. Okay, guys, that was NiziU Make You Happy official music video. Little time travel. I forgot how long ago this video came out in the song, but as usually as a new fan of a group, sometimes you gotta travel back in time and check out some of like their newer work so you can understand how far they came along and how good they was, and like they just kept getting better and better, and now this is amazing. Like just so good. So this is NiziU. Make sure you go check out my other NiziU videos on my channel. I leave it somewhere like a playlist, and I'll leave like top of the screen, like whatever different direction. So if you're new, make sure to subscribe, like, comment below any video suggestions you have. Make sure you check out the other videos on the channel. Shout out to all the support and subscribers. We're just gonna keep going and we're gonna take over the world. So see you guys in the next reaction.